Today on Locked On Phoenix Suns, after months of waiting, the Suns finally have their point guard. And I like it even more than I did when I first saw it come across the timeline. I'll tell you why. Next.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
And we're back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Brendon Kleen, your host and a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 7 seasons, as well as the host of the Just Basketball Show. Welcome to Locked On Suns. Thank you for making us your first listen to kick off your Wednesday. If it is a holiday week for you, last day before then, thank you for spending it here as free agency rolls along. We're free and available everywhere, guys, including YouTube. So if it's your first time or you just haven't bothered to before, hit that follow or subscribe button. Get a new episode in your feed every single Monday through Friday. Throughout all the news, Summer League, and much more as the offseason continues, get locked onto the Phoenix Suns each and every day right here. Become an everydayer. Today's episode brought to you by Gametime, the best place to buy a ticket. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. All right. Monte Morris, the newest member of the Phoenix Suns. Of course, not official until July 6th. You know how that all goes. But the news coming in courtesy of Shams Charania on Tuesday, shortly after the Suns introduced Ryan Dunn and Oso Ighodaro, which I don't think I even have time to talk about today, but that's all right because the signing is the bigger news. He's 6'2". He was drafted in 2017, meaning that this is year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 for Mr. Morris. And he is the point guard that the Suns have been looking for. And to me, he is exactly the right type of point guard, okay? And that is why it's funny, right? I mean, maybe you just think I'm an idiot, but I did a whole episode on Tuesday basically setting the stage for what I assumed would be a Kyle Lowry signing before long here on Tuesday. It didn't happen. Instead, it was Morris. But as part of that, I said, I'm not a huge fan of the Morris option for this and that reason and on and on. And I honestly think I wasn't thinking about what he could bring, and I was thinking more about the perfect. And I do that all the time in the offseason, so that's on me because this is a good addition. This is, for 2 main reasons, a good addition. Number 1, Morris is a point guard in the truest sense of the word. 1, he's small. 2, of course, he used to have these godly, assist to turnover numbers. He has never averaged more than 1.0 turnovers in a season or per game in a season, and he's a high assist player. He can run a pick and roll. He can set an entry pass, deliver the ball to a shooter on time, everything else. So he is a point guard, but he can shoot, and he can spot up shoot, and he can run plays where he gets off the ball and can still be, a threat to knock down an open jumper. And that might sound basic, but the Suns did not have a player like that last year, right? The players that they maybe tried to roll out to fill some of that spot, whether you're talking about Jordan Goodwin or, even like a campaign at times and everything else, that's a very valuable skill set on offense in and of itself to be a high-level playmaker, but also be comfortable to say, hey, I'm going to initiate a set, but I'm going to let it fly if the ball comes my way. Defenses are going to have to at least close out to me. I'm not going to, he's 6'2", 6'3". He's not going to be some kind of sniper because, his shot can get blocked and all those types of things. But you just think to the team he played for most of his career, right? The Denver Nuggets, where Morris was, a backup point guard, but if you remember, for a lot of those years, Jamal Murray was hurt. Well, not a lot of those years. 2 of those years, Jamal Murray was hurt. And Morris developed a really nice chemistry with Nikola Jokic. That is a player who demonstrates exactly what I'm talking about. If you play with Nikola Jokic, nobody dominates the ball. So you better be able to adapt and adjust, and Morris certainly did that. So that's number one. Number two, I just underestimated his point of attack defense. Now, he may not be as versatile on that end of the court as what maybe a Chris Dunn or even a Kyle Lowry or a DeLon Wright could have been. He's shorter. He's not as physically strong. So he's somebody who's going to guard point guards, maybe some two guards, right? His wingspan is not that big for his size. He might have like a +1 or +2 wingspan, nothing spectacular. So I was like, I don't really love that. But again, I kind of was letting, perfect be the enemy of good. These are minimum players. These are bench players. And so Morris is perfectly solid doing that. I went back and looked for the past 2 seasons. Morris was an A. His past 2 full seasons, I should say, because this past year was a lost season. Quad injury when he was in Detroit. Kind of a contract dump anyway from Washington's standpoint in the summer of 2023. Ends up in Detroit, has these injury issues. That team's terrible. Then he gets to Minnesota, and it's like, it's after the deadline. They're trying to push for a 1 seed, and he's backing up Mike Conley and Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and Anthony Edwards can be on the ball. So Morris, we saw him in the playoffs here in Phoenix. He didn't really do much. But the past 2 previous seasons before that, his defense was really solid. I always like to use the B-Ball Index stats. They have a really comprehensive database that not only just kind of gives, it's not just like a all-in-one number that doesn't tell you the details, but they give grades and percentiles and try to ascribe value to specific qualities, to specific skills that that a basketball player can have. And in the past 2 full seasons, he was an A and then a B+ in their perimeter defense calculations. And the main 3 things that he did well were off-ball chasing defense, so guarding shooters. Let's think of an example of who that could be in the Western Conference. The first guy that comes to mind is Dalton Connect, but let's even say Klay Thompson as just an example, right, in Dallas now. Ball screen navigation on the ball, meaning, John Morant or Steph Curry, kind of off ball, also sometimes on ball. And then loose ball recovery rate. He's always graded out really well. So let's just say hustle, energy, and they needed that as well. So if Morris can be a guy that can play on or off the ball, that makes him a lot easier to fit in with the Suns' best players. If he can play defense at that level, that also makes him that much more valuable next to the Suns' best players. So my initial reaction on Twitter was like, I'm curious to see how much he will actually play with Devin Booker, with Bradley Beal, with Kevin Durant. Well, Durant less so, but the 2 guards especially. It's going to be undersized, we know that, but I actually think it could happen. And that's good news. Lastly, just a small tidbit to lead us into the next topic that I have. Morris has chemistry with 2 of the players that are on this roster already. One of which was his teammate his last full season when he was healthy in Washington, and you know where I'm going. That was Bradley Beal. Morris was the starting point guard for that team, which also, of course, had Porzingis and Kuzma. So they've played together, and that offense had some really high highs. It just was, a weak bench, a kind of a young bench, and they weren't really trying to win. But they have that, and then even further back, Morris's first couple seasons in the league when he broke through with Denver, Mason Plumlee was the backup center behind Nikola Jokic. And so they'll have chemistry. So that's just a kind of a cherry on top a little bit. But on a minimum, with the options that the Suns had, when you look at the fact that Chris Dunn did not end up getting a minimum, and maybe DeLon Wright felt like he could, maybe close games in Milwaukee, frankly, filling that Patrick Beverley role for them, I think that truly, Morris is one of the best options that they possibly could have gotten, and I feel really good about it. It also tells us something about the Suns generally and their philosophy this summer. They're valuing vets over upside, and they're raising their floor. Let's get into what both of those things will mean for this roster and for this team this season, Coming up next, first, today's show brought to you by the Gametime app. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets from MLB to the soccer going on here in the Valley, as well as all over the country and beyond. I need to look at the Copa America game on Saturday. My wife is out of town. I don't have a lot going on. I saw tickets. I saw rumors that tickets were as cheap as like $90 to go see a quarterfinal game in Copa America that may very well include Brazil. May have to, as the children say, cop. However, in addition to having tickets, Gametime gets you those deals, last-minute deals, flash deals, zone deals in a particular area, and more, as well as their lowest price guarantee, where they will credit you 110% of the difference if you find the same ticket in the same general area, cheaper on a different app. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets and beyond with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, let's keep it rolling. Vets over upside. All right, and I've talked about this a little bit in bits and pieces, but this cements it, right? The three players that the Suns have added basically since Bradley Beal got healthy in late December, early January, and they started to be like a real team and learn about themselves. Those three players are Royce O'Neal, Mason Plumlee, and now Monte Morris. Veterans. Two of those guys are in their 30s. Monte Morris is 29. He will turn 30 next June. He just had a birthday. And also, low-key, Monte Morris, a Michigan guy. Grand Rapids. Grew up in Beecher, looks like. So, Book, Ishbia, now Morris, Michigan dudes. But those are three players who are going to not make mistakes, not be hit or miss in terms of, executing a scheme, executing game situations and closing games and not being as bad of a fourth quarter team. So many of the things that we saw plagued this team. And I'll get to some of that to close the show. But remember, last year, the Suns went with these mid-prime veteran players. And I asked James Jones about this a little bit as it pertained to the draft today at the press conference. There you go. Look, I'm talking about it. Found a little way to work it in. I asked more about trading the pick and why the Suns chose to go ahead and keep it when all the opportunities of moves with, I didn't name Little or Nurkic, but we all know that's kind of what's out there. I just sort of asked him, what was the thinking there? And he said, look, our roster, when we were trading away first-round picks routinely, our roster was a little bit younger with Ayton and McHale and obviously Cam kind of being the foundational pieces when they traded the pick that ended up becoming Shamet, and then, of course, traded one of their picks for Chris Paul. And last year, they kind of had to with Durant, but this year, he said, it made more sense to try to balance that with depth that was younger because their roster has now gotten older. And so he didn't, he's not allowed to talk about these free agents yet because they're not legally officially signed by the team. But I think if I can just sort of take his answer a step further, their approach very clearly was to say, trying to sort of use the minimum market as our draft last year, which is kind of what they did with the likes of Keita Bates-Diop and Chimezie Metu and Drew Eubanks and Jordan Goodwin even being a throw into the Beal trade. That didn't work. So let's use the draft as the draft, and let's go ahead and use free agency for what free agency is for, which is, older, veteran role players most of the time. And I think the results bear that out, right? I look at, one, they traded 4 of those guys to get Royce O'Neal. They benched Nasir Little. He wasn't a free agent, but they got him back. We're not sure if Okogie's coming back. He's not even really a young guy anymore. But this roster is going to be significant. They got Eric Gordon, so it's not one size fits all with this analysis, but they kind of went both directions here. And Morris is a part of that. The second unit right now, they have one more roster spot, basically. Well, they technically have 2, but I'm kind of assuming at least one of Lee or Okogie will be back. So they basically have one roster spot. We'll see what they use that on. But just for right now, you're probably looking at Beal, Booker, I will say O'Neal, Durant, and Nurkic starting. And off the bench, that means you have Morris, Allen, Plumlee. Most likely, Bol will be in the rotation. And then from there, it's like, is the guy that they sign with this last roster spot going to get the kind of backup forward, fourth forward, let's say, spot on this team? Is that going to be Little? Is that going to be Okogie? Is that going to be Roddy? Probably not. It's just a more cohesive, coherent rotation. And I think on top of that, there's interchangeable pieces. Obviously, the Allen O'Neal thing from the standpoint of the starting lineup, but Plumlee can step in as a starter. We talked with Brendon on Monday about how the value of the continuity stylistically from Nurkic to Plumlee. I said in the first segment, you can see Morris playing with the starters, so maybe there's games where they close a little bit smaller, and it's Morris, Booker, or Morris, Beal, Booker, Durant, Nurkic as their closing lineup as things currently stand. Maybe there's games where it's O'Neal. Maybe there's games where it's Bol, for all we know. If Durant misses a game, O'Neal is a much better spot starter than, who even would have played last year when Durant missed time. Little and Bates Diop and whatnot, right? So it's less of a risk, and most importantly, you're not going to run into the bottom falling out if injuries hit or if some of these players on the younger end don't work out. So let's get to that next. I want to go a little bit back in the history books of this past season, a little bit into the stat sheet of how bad it got when the Suns dealt with issues and absences and why that won't happen now. Plus, dip into some of that fourth quarter stuff as well coming up next. Closing out the show, I want to look at some lineups here to kind of highlight how bad it got at points early last season for the Suns. We all remember Booker gets hurt first week of the season, then he gets re-injured against the Spurs around Halloween. The Suns lost both of those Spurs games and then lost in Philly. They had a 7-game win streak early in the season, but to see when Booker really got back, they were treading water for a lot of the early part of that season. Let me see what their record was when Booker really came back. He returned November 15th against the Wolves. Yeah, I remember now. And the Suns were 13-12 at that point. Now, that wasn't the first game he played, but it was the third game he had played. They lost one of the games that he had played prior to that point, so they were 12 and 11 without him. And obviously, Beal missed all of that time as well. And that was because not only were the players just didn't end up being good enough, but they were pressed into action so much sooner than the Suns ever would have wanted, right? When you're talking about, Bates Diop starting games, Little starting games, at the guard spot, a ton of the dual Goodwin-Okogie lineups, if you remember that. A lot of Eubanks just because, they didn't have Durant at center as an option or anything like that. So I'm going to walk through the most played lineups last year with Durant on the court and Booker and Beal both off the court. Okay? Those were not all games where those guys were hurt. Some of that, of course, is going to show up in just staggering them when they are all healthy. But this lineup played 35 possessions last year, which is, not an insignificant amount. And it got outscored by 14 points per 100 possessions. Goodwin, Gordon, Watanabe, Durant, Eubanks. Gordon, Okogie, Watanabe, Durant, Eubanks was actually a little bit of a positive lineup, but their defensive rating was atrocious. 35 possessions as well. Gordon, Okogie, Little, Durant, Eubanks. We had 33 possessions with Goodwin, Allen, Little, Durant, Nurkic. 33 possessions with Gordon, Allen, O'Neal, Durant, Eubanks. That was even when, everybody was healthy. Goodwin, Allen, Bates, Diop, Durant, Nurkic, outscored by 6.3. All those lineups that I just told you were outscored by at least 5 points per 100 possessions, and they all played at least 30 possessions together. You don't need me to remind you, but those numbers just illustrate how bleak it got. 13 and 12 by the time Book got back, and just getting slaughtered in a lot of those different lineups. They needed Durant to shoot it 20 plus, 25 plus, 30 plus times every game. He was playing insane minute totals, and it was just entirely unsustainable. You go to when Beal got back, which was not the 27th, 29th of December. Is that correct? Against the Charlotte Hornets? Correct. At that point in time, the Suns were 16 and 15. And of course, they finished the season 49 and 33. So from that point on, they were 33 and 18. On pace for 50 plus wins. You have to wonder if those first 25 games with Booker out of the lineup, or I guess it wasn't 25 games. What am I looking at record-wise here? They were not 12 and... They were 5 and 6 when Booker got back. They were 13 and 12 on December 15th. I was looking at the wrong date. And then again, when Beal got back, 16 and 15. You have to imagine and wonder what it would have been like if, for those first 10 games when Booker was out, Allen replaced him in the starting lineup instead of already being in the starting lineup in place of Beal, right? Or even whatever way you want to slice it. And instead of backing up Gordon and Allen, instead of that being Goodwin and Okogie, now you're going to be looking at that being Morris and maybe Damian Lee, maybe another player that they sign. Royce O'Neal is in the mix. You look at the bench in general, which got anchored by Eubanks, Okogie, Gordon this past year, guys that were overmatched. And I'm not trying to make the case the Suns are going to be the 1 seed. Like, don't get me wrong. There's limitations here. But it's not going to be as much of a slog when they inevitably, every team does it. But let's just be realistic. Booker, Beal, and Durant, over the past couple of seasons, each of them have missed time. Now, Durant was an Iron Man last year and deserves a lot of credit for that, but you don't, honestly, load managing Durant a bit? might not be the worst idea if you can get away with it from a depth standpoint. I didn't even mention in the depth side of things, too, that Bol will actually be playing. Somehow he was sitting deep on the bench while they were trotting out all these players who were subpar. And, a lot of you were clamoring to see Bol, and I was not a believer, and I was proven wrong. So even him being part of things sooner will be helpful. But the last thing I wanted to hit on is the fourth quarter, right? I'm not most likely right now, the Suns players closing games will be a lot of the same players we saw last season. However, a lot of their ugly fourth quarters came when they were injured. And it did clean up by the end of the season when Royce came and their depth got a little bit better and they started playing the right players more consistently. So, let's call it like pre-All-Star break was really the worst of the worst in terms of their end of game stuff. And that cost them too. So whether it's Morris playing with them or not, the fourth quarter, everybody plays typically. Some stars will play the whole first quarter. Nobody plays the whole fourth quarter. They tried to stagger, but even if you're staggering and trying to have at least one of your star players on the court throughout the whole fourth quarter, inevitably, you're going to run into situations where, let's say you open that quarter with Durant or a lot of the time toward the end of the season, it was Beal. Last year, that might have been, Beal, Gordon, Allen, Royce, and Eubanks or something, This year, that will be Morris, Beal, Allen, O'Neal, Plumlee. Just me saying that tells you how different it's going to be, right? So that's all good. The ultimate question, I mentioned this yesterday, I'll just continue to beat the drum on it a little bit, right? My test for this offseason all along has been, could the Suns get one more player who is certifiably going to be in the postseason rotation and capable of making an impact in those moments? The best version of Monte Morris may very well be that. I don't really count Plumlee because whether the Suns liked it or not, Eubanks was out there. So maybe that's like half of an extra player because I'm not positive, in the end game of these playoff situations. Maybe Bud is somebody who's more willing to go small and this and that, so Plumlee might not factor in. So we'll see. Morris could be. Bol may well just be him. But last year, Morris didn't crack 11 minutes and 45 seconds in any playoff game. He didn't play in more than 3 consecutive playoff games at all playoffs. So he would play, and then he would get benched by the end of a series, and that was kind of the rhythm. So I'm not sure we're there yet with this roster. Maybe it was not possible to get there outside of a really risky trade like Nurkic or Little. We have not heard any rumors about negotiations on trades like that from the Suns. So we really have no idea if they've been looking at those things, what was on the table, who they've been looking at, the kind of secondary market of the NBA offseason. This is like the third year in a row basically where it's been like this, are these trades. And so maybe once the dust clears, and I talked about this on Tuesday's episode to close that episode out, that, the dust will settle. Maybe a team like Brooklyn with Dorian Finney-Smith or Atlanta with some of their guys or, Charlotte, these bad teams that might just be sort of waiting it out. Maybe there's a deal to be made with them once everything else happens with Lauri Markkanen, Brandon Ingram, Jared Allen, potentially Darius Garland, whatever all of that ends up looking like. But right now, I still don't think the postseason rotation is exponentially better. But the regular season rotation, because of the team's emphasis on experience and on less risky players, it's going to be a much smoother 82 games. That'll wrap us up. Recording with Stephen Perjone Garner on Wednesday. That'll be in your feed first thing Thursday. If there's any news, of course, we'll analyze it. We might start to talk about how this team fits together now that we have a decent feel for it. The Suns are going to announce their Summer League roster soon. We'll probably have some takeaways from the rookie press conference a day late for you as well. So hit follow or subscribe, get that episode in your feed and more throughout the summer. Enjoy your Wednesday. I'll catch you guys then.